My name is Susan. I'm from Seoul originally, but working with a crew based sort of around planet Earth, really, on a project called the Global Assembly. And what we're doing is bringing together a snapshot of the global population, everyday people not selected by election or self-selection, but by lottery, and having them deliberate and learn from experts, and most importantly, each other, on how we plot our way forward as humanity. We're very excited to be at COP to share a bit about ourselves.
And I'm Brian Eno. I'm a musician who's been interested in climate change for quite a long time, but particularly interested in large-scale social movements, how they come into being and how they can be effective. And I suppose one of the reasons I'm interested in doing this is because I want to try to reframe the climate emergency as a sort of civilizational opportunity to rethink the way we're doing things and the kinds of values that we have.
Could you explain a bit about the Global Assembly and how one gets selected to be part of that?
Yeah, I think it's quite in line with what you've been saying, Brian, about the need for a value shift.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about what kinds of faces do you imagine when you think of a policymaker, right? Can it be a girl from South Korea or a dressmaker from Brazil, or does it have to be, pale, frail men in suits? And it's about flipping that notion completely in and of itself. So when we think of policymakers, we usually think about elections, right? Two people in a sort of dramatized fight against each other of who's right and who's wrong. But I think the Global Assembly is about upending that. And the way we select our members is a process that began in June of this year. And we ran a computer program to drop 100 pins on Earth. And it was this 2D map with 100 red pins on it that became 3D through a process of finding local community organizations within a 300-kilometer radius. And those sort of unusual suspects. We're talking about students in Korea, we're talking about a sports club in Brazil, a co-working space in N'Djamena in Chad. Those unusual suspects going on the street or door knocking to randomly recruit members. And it's those sort of everyday people who are gifting themselves to be able to deliberate and learn with each other and work alongside policymakers as their colleagues, really, to plot the way forward.
It's actually quite an old idea, this notion of randomly choosing representatives. It was called sortition, and the ancient Greeks did it. In fact, it was the basis of ancient Greek government for quite a long time. So it's not something we just came up with. It worked for a long time.
That's impressive. I wonder, so how have you got any deeper examples of how that worked in Greece or in ancient Greece?
I don't have any specific examples, but I know that it worked for, what we call ancient Greece probably lasted 200 years or so. And I think for a good half of that, they were using sortition processes. So it's very interesting because it's not intuitive to us at all that you could randomly choose people and they would actually turn out to be good representatives.
Yeah.
But in fact, it works very, very well.
So do the representatives have a big support system whereby they're kind of trained to understand what it means to be a representative, and I suppose potentially even psychologically they probably need a bit of support there as well?
Yeah, so we think about our assembly members not as representing perhaps their nation states, and I think those are the fault lines that we're used to operating with, but really representing their own lived experiences. But that doesn't mean that they don't have supports. I think the support of each of the 100 assembly members really starts in their local community. So even before they join the first Zoom session, many of them, the information materials they read to learn about the climate and ecological crisis are a product of community-based events in their village, in their city, where their fellow sort of neighbors sat together in a circle and read through the information materials in their translation to make sure they were contextualized, to make sure they were eye level. And so it takes a village, and that's where it starts, before they even become connected to others at the global level.
But I don't exactly know the process by which you chose your 100 people this time. How did you do it? You did say you briefly said earlier, but I didn't really get
Yeah. So normally in a citizens assembly, there's a concrete data set to work off, right? So you either have census data at a national level, and you're able to just like randomly mail out invitations and then run a final sortition with the people who respond back.
it. Yes.
For us, again, uncharted waters. There is no census data for the entire world, and so we've had to do a multi-step process. In June, we dropped 100 pins on the map using...
So was that completely random?
This was completely random based on population density, using NASA population density data. And
So sorry, just let me ask you. So how does that work? So do you say in this area there's 35 million people, so they're worth 1 pin. This area has 70 million, so they get 2 pins, something like that, yeah.
So for instance, of course, India has around 18% of the global population, so 18 of our members are from India, 17 of our members are from China, and the only alteration we made was to round up the number of countries who have less than 1% of the global population to ensure that they had at least a probability of getting a point chosen. So for instance, in Korea, we have 1 member. But really the idea is to try to randomize as much as possible.
Yes.
And we were able to work with the Sortition Foundation to come up with this algorithm. But I think my key learning is, so we dropped the pins, we saw the map, it wasn't a very exciting event to see an algorithm run and some pins drop on Google Maps. But the key point for me when it changes from a 2D map on Google Maps to a 3D sort of real community is when we're able to find those unusual suspects. And each of those stories of finding the local community organizations are a journey in and of itself.
Yes.
For instance, in Myanmar, we were pushing and pushing and pushing to try to find a community organization. We're able to liaise with 2 groups who ultimately told us they were unable to do it for safety reasons.
Yeah.
And then out of nowhere, I get a cold call email from a woman who runs an English language class in a little village in Myanmar saying she found us on Twitter and she has to be a part of it. And this woman volunteers to run the sessions in a monastery, liaising with the monks to be able to find safety in her current circumstances because she believes in the project.
Yes.
And it's those connections that are made that bring that voice to the table. And it's often fate and a community that, sends out 300 cold calls to all of the public libraries in Recife that makes that come to fruition. So we find the community organization through that toil. And then those community organizations go out on the street and will often approach someone and ask them if they want to get involved in this global process.
Yes.
Often met with blank stares. And it is precisely that conversation of getting them to commit to this assembly why we needed to decentralize. How was I going to convince someone in Recife to participate in this project, or anyone in our core team? We had to be able to localize down to a community, sports center in that area for those conversations to be facilitated and for this to become a reality.